Moving to Live is a podcast about movement and exercise. We bring you interviews with professionals in the movement and exercise field. The goal is to provide information for other professionals and also amateur movement aficionados, people who understand that movement is part of what makes life complete. Some of the people we interview you will have heard of. They're well known in and outside of the movement and exercise profession. Others you may not have heard of, but they have a great deal of knowledge to share. Many people doing the best work spend their time working with people, not working on their social media presence. We're going to give you a chance to learn from some of these talented and knowledgeable individuals, and we're going to learn along with you. Moving to Live podcasts are going to be short. Each interview will be long enough to impart usable information, but short enough to be able to be consumed in a single bout, during your workout, commute, or even during dinner prep. We all like long-form interviews, but time is valuable. Moving to Live wants to give you the option to learn and be entertained without needing to commit 60 minutes at a time for an interview. Give Moving to Live a listen. Check out our sister podcast, FitLab PGH, which highlights people, businesses, events, and activities in the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area that make movement a priority. Moving to Live would love to hear from you. Want to connect with us or have an idea for somebody you think we ought to interview? Drop us an email, mov2liv@gmail.com, or connect with us on Instagram and Twitter, both _mov2liv. We're excited to bring you these interviews, and we think you'll enjoy each and every one that we bring you. Welcome back to another edition of Moving to Live. Moving to Live, along with our sister podcast, FitLab PGH, believe movement is a lifestyle, not just an activity. With Moving to Live, we try to interview professionals literally across the world, although today we're interviewing a professional from Denver, Colorado. We are in the middle of COVID-19, and high school and college sports are either canceled, postponed, or up in the air. So you read a lot in the literature and in the newspaper about what's going to happen to the student athletes, the stresses that are placed on the student athletes. And as I was reading this, I was thinking there is not a whole lot has been mentioned about coaches, some of them who may be new to the profession, some who may be in the profession many years. So I reached out to Dr. Brian Gearity, who is the program director of the sport coaching program at Denver University, to get his insights on it. First of all, about the education of coaches and why it's so important. And second of all, to give some insight about what we can see with coaches with COVID-19, possible suggestions to help with what's going on in a crazy time. So Brian, thanks for taking time to talk to Moving to Live.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's good to be back with you. It's been a while.
So it's been. Brian was one of our first interviews for Moving to Live. We found out about his long, strange trip from Ohio to the Deep South, all the way out to the Rocky Mountains.
And now look at you. I mean, now you just signed that big deal with Spotify, and it's just glad you've taken me along for a ride.
I know you and I have talked a little bit before at conferences, and I think many people who are in the movement profession across the board kind of think that coaching is something you kind of do when your athletic career is over. Or on the other hand, some people, they say, well, if you can't teach, or if you can't do it, you teach or you coach. And if you can't do that, you consult. But there is a whole body of research that's growing on the importance of the education of coaching and the socialization of coaching, which you're one of the people at the forefront. Kind of briefly describe what is the program at Denver with sport coaching, and who is it intended for?
Well, Oscar Wilde was a terrible teacher. You know that, right? So I'll just check that off my list here. Oscar Wilde is rolling over in his grave because he couldn't teach anybody. So our MA program at DU, and this is kind of because I founded the program, I created the curriculum, and there's guidelines, and I took advice from people and great minds that came before me, and curriculums and structures and national standards. But ultimately, somebody has to decide to design the curriculum. And when they hired me, I was the only person here to start the program. And so it's a combination of sciences and arts and humanities. And that's throughout the courses. It's throughout the actual assignments and the activities that we do. So we've got, biomechanics, everything's about athletic performance and a bit about health and well-being too. And you've got to think about that, because depending on what we're using sports for, sports are not necessarily or inherently healthy. Oftentimes they can be, but right, like nowadays, if you're playing sports in COVID and you get sick or you have long-term damage, or some sports result in long-term arthritis, various tendinitises or pains, psychological, emotional abuse, right? So I always have to say these things, and I'm not cynical or pessimistic. That doesn't have anything to do with about it. It's being realistic and more wide awake and truthful in what you see in sport. So we've got biomechanics, physiology, psychology, sociology. There's a great, I don't know if you've heard of it, Ben, then too, there's a great model back in the 70s. I believe it's Engel. I always get tripped up if it's Engel or Berg. I always get forget, but it's called the Biopsychosocial Model. And it's a way that we would normally talk about just interdisciplinary approaches to research as well as practice. So biology, psychology, sociology. I also add in arts and humanities. And I think that, you can't get too far away from your values and using traditionally artistic humanities philosophy. I had a friend of mine today actually emailed me this morning asking about existential psychology. And so all of these things are underpinned by various value systems and philosophy. So anyway, that's throughout our program. So it's very applied, but it's also highly theoretical, scientific, research oriented, rigorous, and it all goes together. It's theory and practice, and it all goes together, trying to have a holistic, whatever we mean by that, a holistically prepared, coach or practitioner.
And I know some people may be listening to this and they say, well, I'm a coach, or I want to be a coach, or that's my career goal, but I want to coach and fill in whatever your sport is, literally from football to distance running. And they say, I need to know more about whatever the sport is. If I'm football, and I know the common model in football for football coaches to become football coaches is they become GAs, although the GA is questionable as far as the classes they take, but they kind of serve a mentorship of sorts, and whatever the good points or the bad points of the coach or coaches that they are under, eventually they become part of the coaching tree. And it's a little bit atypical, it would seem, in the longitudinal career or how coaches develop to have, say, a program that says, look, we offer a master's degree, or maybe other schools say we offer a bachelor's degree in coaching. Why is it necessary for maybe somebody who is a high school athlete, they're a college athlete, and they're cognizant enough and they're aware that, hey, I'm not good enough to go to the next level, but I love whatever this sport I'm participating in. Why should they get a master's, or what's the benefit of getting a master's in something like sport coaching, rather than saying, I want to get a master's in exercise physiology, or I'm coaching track and field in the field events. I want to get a master's in biomechanics so I can really hone in on the technique, as opposed to maybe a more holistic or a whole body picture, which is what they would get with a coaching degree.
Yeah. Well, I think towards the end there, you kind of touched on it. That's the exact point, is that when you're coaching, it's not just a thing. You're not just a technician, a biomechanist or a physiologist or even a psychologist. Coaching itself is interdisciplinary. You're more of a generalist. It doesn't mean you can't develop, and you should develop, deep knowledge in all those areas, and maybe prioritize different things based on your career path and the experiences that you've had before and your understanding of all those different areas and working with athletes. But even having the self-awareness and the introspection to be critical of yourself, to be humble about it, to try to continue to grow and get better. That's a fundamental knowledge and skill that we want to instill, right? An attitude that we all talk about in higher education, that we want to promote lifelong learners. Okay, but we're going to stick you in nothing but highly specialized scientific classes. And we'll say in passing lifelong learning, but we're not actually going to teach you how to do that or what more about it. We're just going to say, make sure you spend time in the lab or collecting your data or something like that. Of course, you're not teaching then critical thinking or lifelong development. You have to do both. So I will, I'll give a plug for, we just got an article accepted in Strength Conditioning Journal about the absence of psychosocial competencies in strength conditioning. And as the NSCA and other groups too are looking to prepare practitioners, what is the requirements? What are the requirements, the criteria? What are the standards, and who designs those things? And when you look at now the push towards accreditation, it often misses those holistic things. It misses values, humanities, ethics, philosophy, leadership, organizing, group skills. So when you're coaching, right, you're in front of people, you're in front of individuals, small groups, potentially family, recruiting. You're making announcements. You're solving, all sorts of problems that are way beyond physiology and biomechanics and nutrition. Nutrition too, right, is a really interesting thing to study because I always tease, right? I tease because a physiologist because I don't like you people. No, I like you fine. Ben and I were joking before the podcast. In the summer times, I watched a lot of Don Rickles, and so my Don Rickles humor gets amped up. But I tease, right? Like to lose weight, move a little more, eat a little bit less in general. Like the physiology is kind of simple once you kind of put it like that, right? And we have friends that put out on social media, all the diets are the same. They're all the same. Reduce your caloric intake a little bit, and you got to move a little bit more outside of any sort of, chronic disease or hormonal problem. That's basically the formula. And I worked with a guy down in Mississippi who was a big, he owned the biggest health club in town, about 5,000 people or so at his gym. And he never graduated college. And him and I used to joke. We got to be buddies, and we did some work together, and he hired one of our students to run an obesity prevention kind of program. And we talked about, so there are some safety issues there that you need to know about, and referrals and be ready for some things. And he said, well, Brian, nobody can see it on the podcast, but he held out his arm, like his arm's like he's going to do a bicep curl. And he's like, I'm not as smart as you are, but the bicep does this, and he flexes his arm. It only goes in one way. It goes out and it goes down. It flexes and extends. It flexes and extends. I don't know how fancy you guys need to get about things, but that's what it does. And I used to laugh. Like I said, George, you're exactly right. Like I love you because you take something sometimes that we can make too complex and simplify it.
I think that's a great point. I remember at a conference, somebody gave a very nice, very complicated, very interesting talk on periodized training for cycling. And there happened to be a cycling coach that I knew who coached a number of Olympic medalists and a number of Tour de France riders. And afterwards I asked him, what'd you think of that talk? He goes, well, it was interesting. He goes, if I want to improve the cycling performance of my athletes, the first thing I do is work up to doubling the mileage they're riding. He said, then I start worrying about other things. So I think that hits on it too. It's like we do have a tendency to overcomplicate things. The big thing with people who are not necessarily participating in competitive athletes is they want to have a coach at their fitness facility, or they want to have a program just like the pros use.
Yeah.
So I guess a follow-up question to that would be, we have a tendency, I think, as you said, in physiology to overcomplicate things. Are we overcomplicating things by saying, we need to have a specialized training for coaches too? Or is it just something that maybe that we're doing just to promote more jobs for people?
So in this regard, no, I quite strongly believe we actually need to have standards, qualifications, and I quite frankly, I think licensure and regulation of coaches. I think that right now what we have is we have coaches that are hugely influential and powerful, that are in some cases woefully unprepared, and it's no fault of their own. We have a system right now in the U.S. at least where you can basically go coach or work your way up the ladder, in different directions as a coach with very few formal regulations and quality control processes. And so I'm not saying every coach has to have a master's degree. And we obviously cater to a relatively small group of students that are looking to advance their education and get the best education and knowledge and thought leaders and books and assignments and really hone their craft. But and everybody doesn't need to be at that level, right? We certainly have a lot of coaching going on with youth that we don't want to make it so hard that we lose out on the human capital or the labor force to do this work. Now, that being said, again, I'm appalled that we have so much physical, psychological, emotional, sexual abuse in sport, and that we see constantly people being yelled at and physically hurt And now we're talking about, exercise or sport in COVID times, and who's really going to win and lose, and why are we doing some of these things, and how can we be trying to reach the goals that we have for sport, or the aim of it, while being safe, so how do we be effective and safe doing those things? And at the elite level or the performance level, sport is often not healthy. So we can kind of, cut the narrative, the garbage on that narrative, and just call it like we see it, and what we want for the 5-year-old and the 15 and the 25-year-old can vary dramatically. Now they all might be playing football, or they all might be running, but the meaning and the practicing of what they're actually doing can vary considerably. And I think that's one of the very odd, unique things about sport, is that you're technically kind of doing the same thing, but the practice and the training and the meaning and the treatment can vary wildly. And it's too much like the Wild West out there right now. And so, yes, I think and I'll close. I think fundamentals are massively important. And I think it's kind of like when you take let's say a intro to finance class, or an intro to home ec or cooking class, with a little bit of knowledge, right? And you can develop it, you can kind of appreciate it, and you can go explore further. But at least you kind of have a baseline to work off of, versus advanced periodization model. I always laugh at periodization models too. We can joke about that. Nobody's periodization model planned for a pandemic. So all of your periodization models literally have gone out the window, and it's nonsense. Not only because it's a pandemic, but at another level, it's a macro theory that you're trying to explain complex things that are constantly changing, with these rather broad categories in 1, 2, 4-year formats. Periodization ain't the cure-all. It's not a panacea. So while we don't have to go down that advanced road, we can also try to at least my man George knows that the bicep flexes the arm and the tricep extends the arm. Not everybody that's doing a personal training or sport has to know how many molecules of ATP are released in this particular way in this particular time. Like, in that regard, yeah, I do think we get into overkill. I bring up. Let me ask you. I don't know if you saw. I saw this on Twitter. Francis Carnes, the NIH director, was talking about precision nutrition and the next frontier in NIH funding.
I did not see that. No,
it's interesting because NIH, guys, stands for National Institute of Health, and Francis Carnes is the director of it. He's been director for years, as far as I know. But you look at what he's talking about. Advanced nutrition concepts, human genetics, timing of things, and nutrient timing, I assume. And I look at that stuff and go, geez, man, it'd be nice if we would have more parks to play in, if we had more quality coaches, if we had sidewalks. Do we really need to fund? And I've reviewed grants, for the NSCA, and I remember one of them was had reviewed the literature and said most of the research on interval training looks at 6 sets at 25-second rest, and I'm going to look at 30 seconds rest. And I just kind of throw my hands up and I go, I can't get excited over that. Like, I can't get excited. Like, I get that it can be important in explaining some of those minute mechanisms of human physiology, endocrinology, and that. But when people don't have just quality coaches or safe environments, or they live in a food desert, like, those are priorities. We need to be helping those people out. Like right now too, right? In COVID times, the sales of bikes and outdoor camping supplies and all that is skyrocketing because people are craving to move. A lot of the gyms are closed. So how can I get outside? How can I do something and move and be free? Where's the infrastructure for that sort of thing? And we talk about America's infrastructure problem. I would include not just parks and roads and bridges, but outdoor spaces. As I said, parks, outdoor spaces and recreation areas. I'd love to see us find ways to make like at-home physical activity right now too. Peloton, right? The bicycle sales too for those guys are through the roof. So what can we do to help people kind of move and be healthy and enjoy themselves in this crazy, stressful time?
We're talking with Dr. Brian Gearity. He is the director of sport coaching at Denver University. Brian, you raised up a couple of points in in this that I want to go back and touch on. First of all, I think your point that not everybody needs to get a master's in coaching or master's in something else is good, but you have to think that many of the people who are getting master's degrees are going to be practitioners. They're not going to be in the lab. So hopefully, organically, it's going to come down, just for example, in your specialty with the coaching, that if it's explained and educated that, look, you don't use exercise as punishment when somebody doesn't do anything, or if you're working with distance athletes or female athletes or male athletes who are prone to eating disorders, you don't do public weigh-ins and things like that. You have to think that if they're being educated about the why, that this is going to pass down to the coaches, like, look, this is just the way we do it, and here's why we do it. So a lower level of coach or a coach who doesn't get the degree is still going to get the knowledge at some level, because the higher level, the master's level coach learned not only the what, but the why, and now they can teach the what.
Yeah. Some sort of like diffusion, like this intellectual capital diffusion throughout society now from the well-educated coaches. It's hard. I'll say this, a lot of our students, especially the younger ones, or the ones that are making career transitions into more professional full-time roles in coaching, there's a lot of social pressure. There's a lot of fitting in that goes in sport. And the idea that I can tell you, I've had students tell me too, like, I hear what you guys are saying in the classroom, and I'm reading these things in the books, and I see the research, and you guys explain it very well, and I understand it. But the people I'm working with, or the league that I'm participating in, is doing all of these other things. What do I do now? And basically what they're asking is, are you sure about this stuff? And they're asking, I think these guys are crazy. What do I do? And how do I navigate this stuff? And so we actually talk about, the micro politics or organizational politics of these kind of things, the relationships. So, yeah, I think that there's a lot of good organizations that have professional development, and that are, we have a lot. I was at a conference years ago too. One of the big names in the field, Dan Gould, was actually talking about translational research. And Dan's I don't say old, but he's an experienced sports psychologist at Michigan State. And, there's some irony there about being at Michigan State. But he's talking about translational research. We have all this knowledge, and it doesn't trickle down too. How many, pick a topic, right? Ben, pick a topic. Like, we can talk about how people disregard science nowadays, and any type of science, especially social science, because that's more easily refutable, apparently, than physical science. At least nobody, I think, is arguing too much against gravity or the need for oxygen. But
I'm sure there's somebody on Twitter doing that.
You're going to get in. I hope for you flat Earth people, make sure you email Ben afterwards and tell him that the Earth is flat, and, send him a nasty email. But yeah, again, but why is it the Wild West? Like, what other profession? So the quick history of it, like, what other profession nowadays, and it's not a profession. That's the first thing. It's not a profession. When you look at how people have tended to define a profession, coaching is not a profession. It does not meet most of the standards that we associate with being a profession. But you look at, right, attorneys, medicine, nurses, nurse techs, barbers, childcare workers, social workers, psychologists. You name it. Real estate agents. Coaching is one of the few, and I think probably the most significant or powerful, aside from politicians, because they have no training either, which, right, keep your politics out of my sports, or your sports on my politics, which obviously is a joke right now too, because that's what everybody's talking about, is the politics of sport and trying to continue to play. So anyway, the point again was, coaching is so unregulated that I think it needs to change. But phys ed, over the last 120 years now in the U.S., physical education has gone down the crapper, that we have dismissed it as something less rigorous than math and reading and science. The schools have taken phys ed out of the classroom or out of the requirements. It's often taught by somebody who's ill-prepared, or, is really has more of an identity as a coach than a physical educator. We emphasize sports, competitive sports, more than physical education. The two are not synonymous. And then we've expanded the education for athletic training, physical therapy, and physicians in medicine and nursing and allied health fields, all of that community health workers. But kind of skating through the middle of all this has been coaching. So you've got, phys ed has kind of gone down, sciences and health sciences has gone up, but sport coaching and everything kind of tightly affiliated with it has just kind of snuck in there. And so you look at especially the professional coaches or the collegiate coaches, why don't they have to have degrees and licensure and professional development and accountability? How is it that somebody can be constantly doing like really serious, unethical things and be found, so-called guilty or culpable by the NCAA or maybe by the corrupt USA? We'll pick on USA Gymnastics. And I just finished watching Athlete A, I believe it is, the Athlete A movie, which is a great movie to watch about how Steve Penny at the USA Gymnastics covered up their abuse for years. Right? Like none of that should be happening. And I think and we live in an age where people want to bemoan the government and say government bad. I want good government. I want good regulation. I want people like you and me and others that really care about it and they're going to be thoughtful about it to help establish licensing boards and regulation for coaching and the administrators, because like Steve Penny wasn't even a coach. He was a CEO or president of USA Gymnastics, and they know about things and they don't do anything about it. It's the same as various owners or athletic directors that are found culpable of that. And that's where I
know one of the things my dad once told me when I was relatively young and naive. He said, Ben, one of the things you always need to keep in the back of your mind when you're talking about big organizations, and I think this is across the board from companies to national governing bodies to sports leagues to institutions of higher education, is the majority of times they exist to perpetuate themselves.
Yeah.
And if you remember that,
yep.
It doesn't mean you can't do good or you can't behave ethically, but remember you may be swimming against the current. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad thing to do.
Well, I think that's a great observation. Was your dad a sociologist, by the way?
He was a political scientist and then a Presbyterian minister.
So, but he gets organizations, he gets politics, he understands how societies can reproduce themselves.
I think that's a quality liberal arts education. You learn how to think.
Yeah, you see the production of inequality. You see the production of power, economic capital. And the way that you can entrench systems, and you have organizations, and we don't have to name businesses, but look at the stock market, of right now, and who has been the winners in the stock market, and they're all monopolies. These guys they all should be guilty of antitrust regulations, and then the same thing in coaching, and the same thing in sport. That you've got folks that are trying to hold on to power, and they're doing not so good things, and they need to be regulated, and that shouldn't be controversial. We should be doing that.
I know your point you made a few minutes ago about physical education essentially going down the crapper. One of the local school districts here in the Pittsburgh area announced fairly recently that they'll have remote classes. In other words, the teachers will be in the classroom. Students will come in. Actually, they're not coming in for 6 weeks, but they'll have live over Zoom classes. And just later, I was talking to her daughter is a grade school teacher, and her son-in-law is a physical education teacher. And I said, oh, well, what are they doing for physical education? She said, nothing. If there's ever a moment or a time to make movement a lifestyle and to teach kids that you don't have to have other kids, you don't have to have a gym or a baseball field. There's all kinds of things you can do, whether it's in your home or if you're fortunate enough to have a yard, that I think schools are missing, who are not doing this, are missing out on a huge opportunity for a generation of kids.
Yeah. But it's somewhat sad because I'm still kind of have that liberal arts. I went to John Carroll University in Cleveland, Ohio, and so I had a 2-year liberal arts core, and then you do the 2 years in your major. And even in your major, you're still always talking about philosophy, ethics, and the social aspects. And I still have a dream that physical education and human movement can be a place to explore yourself, to create things, more like an artist. And practice not only self-care in the sense of de-stressing, but also practicing who you are and discovering things about yourself. And I've in the past 6 months have refound my love for riding my bike, that I loved as a kid. You couldn't get me off the bike as a kid. So I think you could do physical education now. It just takes work, and the idea that, the idea now that physical educators have to point to the cognitive benefits of physical education, it makes me sad, that we justify physical education, not because you have a body that you're going to need for your whole life, and not because you enjoy moving your body, but, oh, by the way, if you do physical education, it'll also help your math scores, or it'll help your science scores. And you go, well, I speak about how STEM reproduces and entrenches itself as a power system. STEM is great, but it's not the only way to understand your world. And who does, I would go further, right? Who benefits from all this STEM? Who benefits from science and technology? Engineering, math, like who is doing it? Is it the drug companies? Is it, big tech companies, where Facebook, Amazon, healthcare companies, big pharma? Are they the primary beneficiaries? Because our healthcare in the country still isn't that good. And constantly working, and people are less and less in shape, or more and more obese, whatever that means. If we focus more on social inequalities, critical thinking, maybe we could solve some of these problems that we have, rather than reinforcing the same old systems. That's why I'm a radical on that regard.
Curious also with something you raised about 10 minutes ago. It seems like every time I pick up the online version of the New York Times or Sports Illustrated or a blog post, you're reading about another league or another national governing body or another team where the coach did something from either at the base level unethical to sleazy to illegal. Right now I think there's something going on with weigh-ins and a system of abuse with athletes' weights at a college in New England. A women's basketball coach was just fired. Why are we? And I know that if you mentioned USA Gymnastics, that there are some national governing bodies, there are large lists of coaches that float around that say these coaches should not be coaching for various reasons, and yet they're still coaching. Why are we starting to see this come out, do you think? Do you think this is because of social media? Do you think people are saying enough is enough, or what's the reason?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think social media has obviously transformed our recent age, and the explosion of all the streaming services and the social media has given more voice to marginalized or oppressed, groups, or people you just don't hear from as much. And when they're able to organize and develop a hashtag and mobilize a small group, it can kind of snowball into something larger. And the same thing with, like I just referenced, Athlete A, and there's tons of movies. I obviously, you and I nerd out about over this stuff too, but I sent our faculty this morning, I was doing some research, and I found the updated link at the University of Denver here for all of the services, the subscriptions that we have to various, documentaries and movies and whatnot, to share with all of our faculty so we can put it in classes, especially as we go to look to teach via distance this fall. So there's so much of that right now. So it creates a push, more. And there's, just like as people start to have various capital or resources, they can promote it. And that's why you've got more recently in the past several years. And again, it's a fraction, but you've got more movies about Black Lives Matter, race and ethnicity, slavery. These things were old stories in a way, but they've always been there. Just the people with more power and capital could not get the stories out. They couldn't promote it as much, right? Because of entrenched systems of power. And again, that's not a radical, that alone is not a radical thing to say. It's just, that's actually an observation. It is what it is. Last night I started watching this movie called, The Black Godfather, about, I forget his first name right now, but his last name was Avant. And he's a big promoter of music and entertainment in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Tremendously, wildly influential, and you realize all the people that he touched. So, quick digression into sports or music. Another digression as I get off track and you bring me back in. The Sociology of Sport journal just published a special issue on the intersection of hip hop and sports. So they all go hand in hand. That's why sports is so cool, because it touches on everything in society.
And we're here in the US, we're somewhere, depending on when you started taking it seriously, 5 months into COVID-19. In the spring, it was easy to say, well, some athletes lost their spring season or part of their winter season if they were in a winter spring sport. But now we're in the fall, and there are a significant number of high school students, college students, and even professional athletes who aren't going to have a season, or they say maybe we'll have it in the spring. And there's been a lot of conversation about the effect on them, but there hasn't been a lot of talk about the coaches who, if they're taking it as a profession, even though there's still room for the profession, if they take it seriously. So I guess two-part question to expand on is, first of all, as somebody who's in the profession of educating future coaches and current coaches, what are your concerns with potential problems that coaches may face because of what's going on?
Yeah, it's a lot. You actually said at the beginning too, in passing, right? And it wasn't probably an intentional. You had said we're halfway through COVID, and I think I'm listening like, oh, we're halfway through. Okay, that's not too bad. We've only got maybe another 5 months to go.
Yeah, I probably misspoke. I should have said we're about 5 months in.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. I can't wait for January of 2021 now. Heck yeah. Get me past this too.
You know me, Brian. I'm an optimist.
Oh man, you said it. I mean, I was listening to. I like Cornell West, right? And they were talking about optimism, pessimism, and hope. And what real quick. So I'm trying to see if I can get it right while I'm thinking about it on the fly. But optimism and pessimism were like the predict like the. I'm trying to think how they said it. In the face of known obstacles, you can be positive, pessimistic or optimistic. And then he differentiated. He said, hope is when you really don't know. So I just, right, as an intellectual, I just paused for a moment and like to think about that one. And it seemed to be kind of an astute observation. So, okay, back on track here. Give me the word. What are we talking about? My coaches. I got you.
My coaches is like, what are you as an educator of coaches? And I'm sure some of this is coming up if your semester hasn't started yet, or it is started. It's something that's a great topic of conversation, although probably not necessarily the topic that you wanted to have 6 months ago.
Let me do myself. So so we're always teaching. We have year-round classes. So we're 10 weeks. We have classes all the time. We're actually, we're just finishing week 8 of the summer quarter. We start the fall in a month. But we're constantly in touch with our students and talking to them about classes, professional development, career development. Let me point to 2 things that I do to bring light to the issue. I've mentioned so far, and I do this intentionally because I'm kind of embodying it when I do it. This summer, I tend to listen to on YouTube old, Don Rickles, I mentioned, and old comedians or new comedians for that matter too. And I realized that during this current time, I'm not listening to music like I used to, because I would get in a car and you listen to the radio or, NPR, the podcast, whatever you're doing, Moving2Live, and you're listening to all these things and you can de-stress a little bit. You can chill out. You can enjoy it, whatever your genre is. And so I'm listening now in the house, and I'm trying to remember to listen to a little bit more comedians. I tend not to listen to too much or watch too many comedies. But I've been doing that a little bit more than usual lately. And I've also been listening to more podcasts lately. And I've been riding my bike outside lately. And so doing those things has been what I'm trying to do to cope with the current stress. Conversations like this are more stimulating and engaging than some of the Zoom meetings that I've had with, faculty going back to campus and school updates and committees and staff meetings, administrative meetings, planning for the fall. I mean, all of this is not very stimulating. It's very tedious. And so you've got to take breaks and find ways to cope and deal with that as an individual. And hopefully you can find ways to de-stress. So those are a few things that I do. Other people, right? And we have this in our program in different modules where we're talking about, we know that especially at the full-time or high performance level, coaching can be extremely stressful. With the pressure to win, please parents, to care about your athletes and the community, you really are trying to do the best that you can. For those that are on that bandwagon, that are really on board with doing the right thing, it can be exhausting. And now you're faced with COVID and social distancing or physical distancing. You got to wear a mask. You got to try to follow the state laws and rules. You want to keep people healthy, but you're also trying to not only improve their performance, but you're trying to help develop them in a larger way, right? We talk about using sports to build character and other lifelong skills. So how do I do these things? And now you have to stop and ask, is it now really fundamentally? And people have assumed this for years, and they're probably off base a little bit. You assume that your sport, you talked about an athlete who loves their sport becoming a coach. And that for me is probably one of the worst reasons why you can become a coach. You become a coach, in my mind, and and there's just problems with this. You become a coach not because you just love your sport, but because you love people. Because you see the opportunity to engage with and develop a relationship with people, to help educate them, to help them understand themselves, and to help build a relationship that can be sustainable over time, where they come back and graduate and see you, where you can help them be successful in other aspects of their lives. They can help change you. So a much more educational kind of view than just a transactional or a performance view, or that the sport has an inherent magical power to it itself. And I'm trying to be intentionally, I'm not mentioning any specific sports, because sport, whether it be basketball or football or lacrosse and hockey and softball, etc., swimming, the sport itself has very little power. Doesn't live in a vacuum. We can't understand sports in this kind of pure, just sporting way, in that by magically playing or throwing the ball, that bam, you're like a great person. No, you're learning how to run and put your left foot in front of your right foot, or when you break it down into a more of a technical thing, it sounds quite silly. And that's what some people do when they want to dismiss sport as trivial. They'll do those types of things. And they'll say, all you're doing is putting the ball in a hoop. That's nothing special. But obviously that's not just it. It's not just that. It is a larger social, psychological event. It's a symbolic event too. So I think about sport in these ways too. Anyway, the point then is too that coaches nowadays and our students can think about developing themselves, and they should have been doing this to begin with. You need to understand yourself in multiple ways. And this is part of the problem that coaches communicate to their athletes is they want utter commitment and dedication to the sport. And that can create over-identification with the sport, over-identification as being an athlete or a coach. Rather, I am a multifaceted, complex individual. I have multiple identities. I'm a brother, I'm a sister, I'm a coach, I'm a father, I'm a community figure, I'm a teacher, I'm a physiologist, I'm a sociologist. I have multiple roles. I'm an actor, I'm a painter, I'm a reader, I'm a writer, I'm a blogger, right? And so when you have that protective armor of being more than just a single thing, when your main activity or your main identity, and they're not synonymous, when those things get harmed or stopped, as we're having right now. And I think about sports the same way as like actors right now and Broadway theater performers. They can't perform, and it's got to be killing them. So I think this is a great opportunity for coaches and athletes to explore other things. Now, if you're still got a scholarship or you're a professional and you got to keep going, or you got to, eventually you're going to probably have a season, or you're going to play another sport, or you're just a physically moving body. You got to keep moving. You got to stay active. You got to do things. And we got to find a way to make that happen. Individually as well as socially and as a community. But what a great opportunity it is right now to try to do more and become something more, or explore these other areas of your being in the world, to use a more philosophical term.
I'm curious if any of your graduates or maybe current students have come to you and said, now I really get what it means, some of the things that you're teaching in these classes. Now, for the first time, I'm taking time for myself, whereas, maybe 8 months ago, I couldn't because I was coaching 7 days a week and I was just inundated with this. And now I'm understanding it's not just the coaching, it's taking care of everything else with me that's going to make me a better coach in the long run.
I'm trying to think of a few examples when you say that. Yeah, there's a few. There's yes and no, and there's both. I had a prospective student who's starting with us this fall reach out recently, and universities right now are sending out probably too much communication to students. Overloading them with, this week in COVID we're doing this, and next week it's now this week in COVID we're doing this, and I get it from my kids' school district here, and it's just, it's like more noise and more stress. And I commented to this prospective student, and I said, yeah, these, things right now are really crazy, and I'm pretty resilient, and I've got a lot of resources. I've got a job, I've got stability, and I'm very fortunate in that regard. And I'm even stressed though. So when I feel it, and I think I'm kind of on the high end of, so-called mental toughness, resiliency, and all that, then I know other people must really be struggling much worse. And when you start listening to things and you realize domestic violence and, self-harm, and we was talking to a couple of guys from USA Football last week too, that, they're really concerned about those people. So it's the same thing with this student. When I was able to reveal myself and kind of share that you are not alone, that you are validated and what you're feeling is accurate, and we are here to support you and help you. So communicate with us and reach out to us, and we can provide that buffering system. We can provide what we call maybe like a relational resiliency and relational caring to support you. Because in this case, we're going to help each other make it through this time. And yelling at somebody or adding more stress to them, or, basically telling them, well, go figure it out, or not even being on the radar about it. At least that way we're trying to figure out support systems and pull the resources that we have to help people. So I think a lot of coaches are trying to do those things. Now, on the other side of it, there are other coaches, and I can be guilty of this too, that with this so-called extra time, because you're not maybe doing the other day-to-day stuff that you had been doing, that means you're just spending more time preparing, planning, creating materials, maybe reading. You're at the desk, right? I've done more podcasts too myself in the last 3 months than I did in the past year, because everybody's, I got time to do this now, and you're like, wait a minute now. And those things can be unhealthy, So we actually thought about the other day doing a research study, and people, the researchers will be doing research now on COVID for years to come. But I wonder about how different groups of the population, athletes compared to non-athletes and actors and others, and students, how are they all perceiving stress and coping right now? Because we were questioning, right? Football, this was USA Football. Football makes you tough, builds character, and you're going to be able to take this on and blah, 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 run through a wall. Well, right now is not the time to run through a wall. And we really don't know how athletes are coping right now. And so studying that systematically through some research would be an interesting thing to really see how are they doing. And I would bet you would find some interesting findings, like the collegiate athletes or those seniors that they've lost their seasons, or the coaches that are really identifying with the role of a coach and they don't have that opportunity, or that was their paycheck. And I feel for a lot of those folks, right? Our unemployment is at the highest rate it's ever been in, 50, 75 years, something like that. And just because I'm all about the economics right now. Our unemployment rate right now, or the weekly jobs report, if anybody's interested, so I'm taking an economics class now, and there's a website, Fred. Fred is the Fed Reserve of St. Louis. You go on the Fred website, and I had to do this for a class project. Our weekly unemployment claims are still about 3 times as high as the average. So it was always tracking at just under about 400,000 per week for years. And now we're at 1 million plus, even on the slowdown. And that's on the way down, but it's still 3 times as high as the average has been from historically. And so all of these people, including coaches and professional athletes, are changing their livelihoods and perhaps losing their paychecks, and that not including some of the teacher coaches at the high school and collegiate level that don't make that kind of money and don't have the bank accounts and the financial resources. So they're worrying about, not only am I missing my love for the athletes in the game, but also I got to worry about paying rent and paying the car note and, healthcare. And if I get sick or I got to take care of my cousin or somebody in my family, I just had a former student actually last week who got COVID, and I saw it on social media and I reached out and checked on her and how she's doing. And her dad got it too, and was very sick and they were in the hospital, so we're going back to basic need and basic survival for some people right now. We're not talking about self-actualization or, these more fancier ways of trying to be free and really empowered and live a great life. We're talking about surviving. And that's a reality for some people right now.
Great insight from Dr. Brian Gearity. Brian is the director of sport coaching at the University of Denver. He was generous enough to sit down with Moving2Live, describe a little bit about the need for education and coaches. And then also I've had the opportunity to talk to a physical therapist and an endurance coach about the effects of COVID on them. And I wanted to get Brian's insight on things that coaches could look for, things that coaches could do. It's interesting, Brian, that your suggestions for things that coaches should be doing. Way back in April or May, I interviewed a high school cross-country coach, and some of those very things that you were saying, taking time for himself, reaching out to his athletes, not to talk about cross-country, but just to see how they were doing. He was doing that. So either something has trickled down from your program or he had a good mentor somewhere along the line.
Yeah. I mean, I'm finally reading some books that I've been wanting to read for years and put off. And I think too, and I think of myself as a coach or as a professor too, right? I get to carry these lessons on and dialogue with other people. So I've just started reading more Anton Chekhov, and trying to read some of these great works that I haven't been able to read. And, when I was coaching full time too, I would share poetry or philosophy, et cetera, with athlete leadership lessons with athletes. So knowing that you're investing in your practicing self-care to handle your own stress and develop yourself, I think is fantastic. And I hope that people that not only do it now, but then also in the future, but we also do with our students that it's not just you, but it's think about it at multiple levels. So yes, it's you right now as an individual, but it's the people around you, it's the team, it's the organization, it's the community, it's the society. And the more we can build up our support systems through resources and removing barriers to physical movement or activity and sport, the better off we're probably going to be long term. And so we were talking before we got started, we have got to invest in infrastructure, research and development, ways to think and have lifelong learning and development, because those are the resources that are going to prepare us for shocks. And when you have, it's funny, I bring in economics again, and I'm really digging it. I took econ as a freshman in college, and I changed my major to phys ed, exercise science. I swear. I took econ for a year. I said, I'm not doing this for the next 3 years. There's no way. And I changed my majors, and I loved it. But now I'm in econ now again, and I find it fascinating. Right? And 18-year-olds probably don't care much about econ very much. At least I didn't. And what causes a recession? Right when you pause, what causes a recession? Sudden shocks to the economy. Oil shocks, price shocks, pandemics, bubbles, right? Bubbles burst, and it creates a shock through the economy, and then the economy crashes. So the same thing, right? With coaches, let's reduce those shocks or prepare for those shocks. Put some money in the bank. Who fares better when there's a recession? People that have money in the bank because they can weather the storm a bit better. And Americans tend to be terrible. This is not, again, an opinion. Americans are terrible at savings. And sometimes that's because we don't have enough wages, but it's also because we just like to spend. We like to have a good old time and get out there and spend things. We buy things. We live in a consumer culture. Well, put some of that money in the bank or develop your infrastructure around you so that way you have a greater support system and you can handle those unexpected shocks.
Great insight from Dr. Brian Gearity. He gave us some good information to think about with coaches, and even if you're not in coaching, and a little bit of economics thrown in too. Brian, thanks again for taking time to talk to Moving to Live. I'm sure at some point in the future, we'll be talking to you again.
That's great. Thanks for being here, Ben. If anybody wants to get a hold of me, I guess you can follow me on social media at Dr. Gearity, DRGEARITY, and hope to hear from you. And I think this is a great resource that you're providing for everybody too. So thank you, Ben, for your work.
And we'll have that contact information on the show notes when we publish the show too. Thanks for listening to the latest episode of Moving to Live. Make sure you check out the show notes for contact information for our latest guest, as well as links about all the things we talked about. Intro and exit music is Traveling Light by Jason Shaw. You can subscribe to Moving to Live on Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and Google Play, and be notified about new episode releases. Have any questions, comments, or suggestions? Drop us an email, mov2liv@gmail.com. Connect with us on Twitter or Instagram, both _MOV2LIV. Please tell your friends about Moving to Live. It's a go-to place for information for movement and exercise professionals and amateur aficionados who understand that movement is part of what makes your life complete. Until next week, keep on moving.